dear students, to the massive open online course in International Economics. In today's module, we are going to deal about issues in liberalization. The main objective of this module are, we would like to deal with a detailed study of regional trade agreements. We would introduce the concept of trade creation and trade diversion. We will also discuss the external effects of a free trade agreement, that is, the effects on countries that are not party to the agreement. In the last module, we had dealt with the possible causes of a fractured world trading system. We had argued that Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill notwithstanding, that the world is riddled with the pressure for protection. Although some of these pressures may be justified in the context of market failures elsewhere, other forces stem from well-organized interest groups that seek protection as a means to further their own economic interest, and they do more harm to the society than good as a whole. Now, we all know about GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. The GATT used to measures, basically, the measures that were outlined in the GATT agreement had fostered or at least enabled a surge in various multilateral tariff reductions over the last 7 decades. We have also noted that such reductions have been accompanied by a proliferation of various non-tariff barriers. The non-tariff barriers, we also see that there has been a proliferation of various special cases that have become a rule rather than the exception, and have basically slowed down or stalled any movement towards free trade. But one feature that really stands out is the mushrooming of free trade arrangements in regions all around the world. There has been examples of such arrangements within various clusters of developed countries. Henceforth, when we talk about clusters of developed countries, we will call them North-North. We have clusters of developing countries, which we generally refer to as South-South, and across developed and developing countries, which we generally call them as North-South. Now, if we try to analyze the move from regionalism, to regionalism from multilateralism, we find that this move towards regionalism has generally been encouraged, in a sense, by the principle of multilateralism, which has been enshrined in the GATT Charter. The principle that I'm talking about here is called the Most Favored Nation Clause, or it is sometimes called the MFN Clause, which declares that trade concessions which are made to any country must be automatically extended to all other member countries as well. However, many countries that wish to sign preferential arrangements with one another, perhaps as much for political as for economic reasons, do not wish to see such arrangements automatically extended to all other countries by virtue of the Most Favored Nation Clause. So, it was said that Article 14 of GATT was used, and it has been used repeatedly. So, the MFN, what does that Article 14 usually tell us? MFN need not be observed if some subset of countries wished to set up a free trade zone by substantially eliminating all trade barriers amongst themselves. The seeds of regionalism we thus see is contained in these clauses. So we find economies all over the world taking advantage of this Article 14 of the GATT Charter and trying to build separate free trade zones so that they can take advantage of this article. And so from here we see how the seeds of regionalism was being sowed in the world economy. Now, if we try to look at this concept of regionalism, we will find that basically there had been two waves of regionalism in the world. Now, the first wave of regionalism came in 1960. This followed on the heels of the setting up of the European Economic Community, which we usually call the EEC, which was set up under the Treaty of Rome in 1957. And the United States, which was then a dominant power and a strong proponent of multilateralism, looked the other way, except for the formation of the EEC, which it backed largely for political reasons. So here we find that basically the United States of America was not much interested in this concept, okay? It rather wanted to stay out of it. It's only that it favored the EEC, and that favoring of the EEC was not at all for any sort of international trade or economic reasons, but it was thoroughly political in nature. Now, this wave of regionalism died out in the 1970s. South-South arrangements, that is arrangements between developing and developing world in particular, did not seem to make any such headway in the world economy. Now, when we come to the second wave of regionalism, we find that the second wave of regionalism was basically a phenomenon of the 1980s, and it seemed to stay. It seemed that it had come to stay. The main difference this time between the second and the first wave of regionalism was that the reversal of the stand of United States of America on regionalism. In the first wave, I said that USA was basically not much interested here. But here in the second wave, which started from 80s, we find that US takes an opposite stand. Free trade agreements were negotiated with Israel and with Canada, and even Mexico was brought in as a partner in the US-Canada combine under the auspices of the NAFTA. The European Union by then had also gathered steam, with Greece, Portugal, and Spain entering the community. And then we find countries like Finland, Sweden, Austria also making their presence and making their entry into the EEC. Likewise, Central America had revived its Central American Common Market, which is called CACM. Then we had the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, the ASEAN, has also been regenerated during this period of time. And South America was slowly weighing in with Mercosur, MERCOSUR. So, if we look at the world and the regional trading blocks there, we find that we have United States, Canada, and Mexico forming one zone, that is a NAFTA, which was rather later renamed as USMCA, US, Mexico, and Canada. We can also think in the future that Japan and Asia may form another one. And of course, we do have the European Union now, which has formed a third bloc. So these regional blocks had been on the cards, which did see the light of the day, like European Union. Now the question in front of us is whether this regionalism will ultimately lead to a really true multilateral free trade. This is a hard question for us to examine. So, if we look at this from the concept of the revival of regionalism, this revival of regionalism do raise some very deep and important question. The most central question is that regionalism involves partial trade liberalization, that is, an opening of trade to some partners but not to others. Now, such opening up helps in expanding trade amongst the partners, no doubt. But they do also have a diverting trade from other economies. So it can be that from more efficient non-partners, these countries start trading with more non-efficient partners. So this is what we notice. Hence, there may be efficiency losses involved in a partial move to free trade. And there is no contradiction between this point of view and the assertion that global free trade is an improvement nonetheless. So, hence, we now focus on the concept of whether regionalism is at all viable or not in such situations. Now, regional arrangements across countries with very different levels of per capita income, that is, if they have substantially different levels of per capita income, we find that these type of arrangements really do falter at times, because the distribution effects are too strong and the elaborate system of compensation that is there has to be, or if it is not there, it also needs to be devised in this context. On the other hand, if we look at countries with a similar level of development, which produces similar kind of products and conducts trade in differentiated varieties of the same products, we find here it is far more likely to benefit in some balanced way from trade. In the jargon of economic theory, trade amongst similar countries with a depth of product variety is more likely to lead to an actual Pareto improvement rather than a potential Pareto improvement. The depth of trade in similar products depends not only on the comparable levels of development, it also depends on the level itself. A higher level of per capita income implies greater product variety, both amongst the consumption goods and amongst inputs of production. And both of these make for Pareto improving trades. On the other hand, poorer countries with similar factor endowments may not have much to trade. Their options lie more with the outside world. One possible exception in this case is certainly the import substituting industrialization, in which explicit agreement on industry sharing permits the developing partners to reap some benefits of the large markets while still maintaining a protective wall. However, this sort of integration scheme is often contentious and unstable. Unilateral trade liberalization rather than regional agreements might be the only real possibility open to developing countries. So, hence, after really talking about all these regional agreements, we should now concentrate on the basic theory of regional agreement. That is, there are two important concepts. One is trade creation and the other is trade diversion. Now, both these two concepts are outcomes of a multilateral tariff reduction. But, the second concept, which we called trade diversion, is special because it comes to play only when some, but not all the world's countries are involved in tariff reduction. Now, I would like to take an example to explain this to you. You can see from the table here that I have got 3 countries, country A, country B and country C. In all these 3 economies, the price of mangoes are 35 rupees per kilo in country A, 26 rupees per kilo in country B and 20 rupees per kilo in country C. Now suppose that these 3 countries, A, B and C, they are producing only one commodity, that is mangoes. As you have seen that I have listed the domestic price of mangoes all in the same currency, say rupees per kilo. Now suppose that country A is in a situation where it levies a tariff of 100% on the import of mangoes. So if it levies a tariff of 100%, in that case, all production of mangoes is domestic and it is sold at the domestic market price, which was 35 rupees per kilo. Now, situation 1. If country A forms a customs union with either of the countries, B or C, either one of them, by preferentially lowering tariffs to one of these countries. So if it does that, it will be able to import mangoes at a lower price and be better off. It's very well understood. So this, what we call, is the process of trade creation. Okay. So this is, as I said, we have 2 concepts, trade creation and trade diversion. This is basically the concept of trade creation. I started off with a situation where there are no tariffs. Then I say that country A decides to put a customs union with either of the countries B and C, and we try to lower tariff in one of the countries, and then we see what really happens, and we see that trade creation do take place. Now suppose, instead of 100% tariff to start with, country A initially was in a situation where the tariff on mangoes is at 50%. So if I look back at the table, if the tariff on mangoes is 50%, then country B is going to sell mangoes at around 39 rupees, 26 plus 13. And country C is going to sell mangoes at 30 rupees, that is 20 plus 10, that is 50% tariff, 30 rupees. So in this case, we find that it is easy to see that mangoes would still be imported into country A, not from country B, but from country C. Because in country C, the price of mangoes is 30 rupees now, while in country A, the price of mango is 35 rupees. Now, suppose that country A enters into a free trade agreement with country B. It drops all tariff barriers altogether, but retaining the 50% tariff on the non-member country C. So, A is entering into a treaty with country B. Country C becomes a non-member country. And with country B, country A drops the tariff barriers. So what happens? In this case, what will happen to country B? Country B, it has dropped all barriers, so it will be 26 rupees. While for country C, the barrier is still there, so the price of mangoes in country C import will be 30 rupees. So in this case, we find that consumers will switch to country B, obviously, for mangoes will be imported at 26 rupees per kilo, as opposed to the now costlier source of country C, which carries a consumer tag of around 30 rupees for the mango, because it now has a 50% tariff. Country C is a non-member country. So now what we have initially, in my first situation, trade was taking place between country A and country C in the concept of trade creation. But now because of this strategy that country A has taken, we find that trade gets diverted. We now find that trade diversion takes place. And now, one thing is very important here, that country A might be worse off as a result of this trade diversion. Why is it so? The formation of a free trade area generally involves elements of trade creation, which is a healthy one in nature, and also an element of trade diversion, which can possibly be unhealthy in character from an efficient trading partner outside the free trading bloc. So, the net effects on welfare are in principle ambiguous. we are basically not concerned here with the fate of mango growers in country A. That means basically we are not very much concerned with the distributional aspect of the question. The observation is simply that a partial move to free trade may be harmful from the point of view of overall welfare. Thus, the example shows that even though global free trade may be optimal for the world as a whole, an incomplete move towards free trade may not increase welfare along the way. The reason? Freer trade between a subset of countries may cause consumers to shift from a more efficient supplier who still faces a tariff barrier to a less efficient one who is a member of the free trade group, thereby worsening the allocation of the resources. Now here we come to a very important question. What is the effect on the non-members? Now in this example that I've given here, country C is a non-member. So what about countries such as C who are excluded from this multilateral process? Notice that in this case of the prohibitive tariff of 100%, country C had nothing to do with country A before the formation of the trade bloc, and certainly nothing to do with it even after the formation of the trade bloc. So, the formation of a regional trading agreement between A and B basically leaves country C unaffected. However, this will not be the case if the initial situation had involved trade with country C. Formation of the trading bloc then excludes country C, which makes the country worse off. Although, as we have seen, the resulting trade diversion effect is also bad for country A because country A would be losing some amount of tariff revenue in the process, and there may be other aspects of trade liberalization between A and B that makes it worthwhile overall to those economies. Now, the negative effect on country C may be further heightened if the formation of a trading bloc between A and B is accompanied by increased tariff or trade barriers on countries such as country C that are outside the trading bloc. In this case, even if countries B and C are not competing in their exports to A, C may be the worst off because its other exports to country A or B might be choked off in this process. Thus, regional trading arrangements may impose negative externalities on countries that lie outside the purview of this arrangement. Even though these externalities are partially mirrored in the form of an unwanted trade diversion effect within the trading bloc, they may be overwhelmed by the positive effects that the package deal of a regional agreement might have for the member countries. If we note that the formation of a regional trading bloc may or may not be a good thing for members of the bloc, depending on whether trade creation outweighs the trade diversion effects or not. Nonetheless, the effect on non-members is more unidirectional in nature. Either non-members are affected if initial barriers were so prohibitively strong with that there were no trade with the region to begin with, or they may be negatively affected. So it's very much unidirectional in nature. Now we try to look at regional agreements among dissimilar countries, and it's a paradox that we face. Even though there has been successful free trade agreements between countries at vastly dissimilar levels of economic development, but they are basically not very common phenomena. A leading example in this category is, of course, the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which has been replaced by USMCA on 1st of July 2020. The only parts in the world where dissimilar integration is a serious possibility is East Asia, where Japan can serve as the enormous hub around which the Asian economy might integrate. At one level, the paucity of North-South arrangement is paradoxical. The classical models of international trade teaches us that the opportunities for trade are paramount where there are enormous differences in factor endowments or technology. Now, one way to confront this paradox is to note that although trade brings substantial gains, these gains are not distributed equally amongst all sectors of the population. Indeed, the Heckscher-Ohlin model teaches us that the gains from trade cannot accrue to all unless explicit compensation is paid ex post, that the factors of production that are intensive in the production of the imported good must lose, and the owners of those factors must be worse off. For instance, in the Heckscher-Ohlin world, a developing country with comparative advantage in products that are intensive in less skilled labor should see substantial gains to such labor once trade begins. So in contrast, its developed counterpart will be flooded with labor-intensive products, forcing it to cut back the employment of less skilled labor, thus reducing wage in the process. Of course, this less skilled labor can make investments in acquiring other skills, and it is possible that over time, the necessary adjustments can really be made. However, these adjustments are quite slow and painful, and in situations where the market for education and training is weak or absent, the process can be more painful enough to have serious political consequences. For instance, since the end of the 1970s, countries such as the United States, United Kingdom, they have seen substantial increases in the ratio of wages paid to skilled versus less skilled workers. Just why this has occurred is open to debate, but international trade and the invasion of the third world have certainly been regarded as villains in the popular press and in political circles. So please do not be surprised if you see organized labor siding with protectionist interests in developed countries. Over the last few years, even few decades, we have seen that labor market outcomes of less skilled workers in countries like in the OECD countries, they have undoubtedly worsened. Over the 80s, we have seen the less skilled workers in the OECD countries suffer decline in relative wages, increased unemployment, and sometimes we have seen both taking place. In the United States, the real wages of young men with 12 or fewer years of education fell by around 26% between 1979 and 1993. Between 1979 and 1992, the average unemployment rate in the European OECD countries increased from 5.4% to more than around 10%, and most of the unemployment was concentrated amongst the unskilled workers. In the same period, relative wages of less skilled workers declined slightly in several OECD countries and sharply in others. Now, what are the reasons for this? First reason is skill-based technological change. Microprocessors and other machinery and new methods of production, these have increased the ratio of skilled to unskilled workers demanded at fixed wages. The main evidence in favor of this is the increased proportion of skilled workers employed within firms despite the increase in the relative wages of the skilled labor. Then, of course, we have the institutional changes. There is some evidence of a decline in union power that protects the less skilled workers. For instance, in some OECD countries, they have experienced reductions in union representation. There is also concern regarding the decline in the quality of elementary and high school education. Some countries have displayed evidence of declining test scores. Third, of course, is the increased demand for skill-intensive products. The demand patterns throughout the world have changed. There have been an increased demand for more sophisticated products, perhaps because these are luxury commodities, so they are bought more intensively as income increases, or perhaps because of an increase in the quality of these goods. There is some evidence of a shift in consumption towards more skill-intensive products, but the changes in the demand for skills due to inter-industry shifts in output appear small. And the fourth point is, of course, international trade. There may be this Heckscher-Ohlin trade effect at work, the increased export of countries which are abundant in less skilled labor will lower demand for the less skilled in the developed world. Certainly, there has been increased trade between the developed and the developing countries, and this explanation also cannot be ruled out. So, we can conclude today's module by saying that we did have a detailed study of regional trade agreements. We have also introduced the classical concepts of trade creation and trade diversion. We also discussed the external effects of a free trade agreement, that is, the effects on countries that are not party to the agreement. We studied various types of regional agreements. It would seem, according to Heckscher-Ohlin, that the greatest gains from trade would come by integrating a developing country with a developed one. Conditions of production are so different across the countries that there could be plenty of gains from freeing trade across them. However, we do not see so many agreements across countries with different levels of development. Only NAFTA is an exception in this process, and we invoke political pressure groups as an explanation for this. Distribution effects are strongest when dissimilar countries are involved, and political lobbies to thwart integration are also likely to be very strong as well. Thank you.